The energy that lights our homes with the flick of a switch or fuels our cars as we drive to work seems like a given. It's automatic and always available. But when it's not, life as we know it comes to a screeching halt. Have you ever thought about what it takes to produce this energy? It's a demanding industry that never stops running. The hours are long, the work can be dangerous, and it can be a completely separated world from the typical 9-to-5 desk job.
The average workday is 14 hours, and it is in any kind of weather. So in the summertime, it got up to 100 degrees, and you're wearing a dark blue fire-resistant jumpsuit, a hard hat, and, big boots. In the wintertime, it got down to the coldest day I worked in was negative 38 degrees, which is weather where you can feel the liquid in your eyeballs freezing.
That's Michael Patrick Smith, a writer and the author of The Good Hand, a memoir of work, brotherhood, and transformation in an American boomtown. In June of 2013, he moved across country from Brooklyn, New York to Williston, North Dakota to find work in the oil fields. He had never done this type of job, but like thousands of others, was driven there by the promise of good pay.
The work itself is, you're swinging a sledgehammer, or you're climbing up using a harness onto some rigging, or you're just picking up heavy stuff and moving it around. And there's not much room for error. So machinery gets busted up, and if you're not careful, people get hurt, and people in the oil field get killed.
This work was unfamiliar and opened Smith's eyes to an entirely different way of life. He grew up in rural Maryland, but had spent most of his adult life in cities. He lived in Brooklyn for about 7 years, working various jobs in order to get by, until his opportunities dried up following the financial collapse in 2008.
I first heard about the boomtown from my mom when I was complaining about my job, and I was talking to her on the phone, and she said, well, there's an oil boom in North Dakota. And so I ended up, that was where I first heard about it, and then I became kind of obsessed with stories about it. At the time, the New York Times was running a lot of stuff, and there's some interesting magazine articles. And I became just more and more obsessed about it. But I was also finding that so much of the journalism was sort of about a person who would hop into town for 2 nights, talk to a few people at a diner, and then leave. I'd grown up in a rural area on a somewhat dysfunctional farm in central Maryland. And so I'd grown up in the country, and then I'd lived in cities most of my life. And another factor for me was this desire to kind of reconnect to the country and reconnect with country people and kind of like re-explore those bonds for myself.
Smith packed up and moved to Williston, North Dakota. He found work with a local company there and took on the position of a swamper.
Oil rigs are like the size of skyscrapers, and they sit in one place, or these are the rigs that I worked on. They sit in one place for about 2.5 months until they get oil flowing, and then they need to be moved. So they're set up kind of like giant erector sets or like big Lego pieces if the pieces are the size of fire trucks. And so as a swamper, I was a crane rigger, and I worked on the back of what's called a gin truck. It was for a trucking company, and we would show up and we would pull the oil rigs apart and load them onto trucks, haul them down the road, and then put them all back together on top of a different wellhead. And so my job was to swing the chains and the hooks onto these heavy pieces of equipment, try to keep everything level, try not to knock anybody's head off, and then get the things moved.
Smith says that being a swamper was an extremely physically demanding job that required you to be always on top of your game. If there was one slip-up along the way, it could lead to complete catastrophe. In 2019, there were 22 workplace deaths in the oil and gas extraction industry, according to the U.S. Bureau of Labor and Statistics. But even with these known risks, people from all across the country signed up for these jobs. In 2018, the traditional energy sector employed about 6.7 million Americans, according to a 2019 U.S. Energy and Employment Report. In addition, thousands more migrated in from Jamaica, the Congo, and the Philippines to find work on the oil fields.
North Dakota was like the Wild West. It's kind of the cliche, but it's also pretty true. I mean, I worked with guys who had been bronc riders in the rodeo, guys who'd been driving trucks since they were 12, 13 years old. They were shifting gears on big rigs because their fathers did it or family members did it. And it was a life lived much closer to the bone than a sort of more comfortable life that you encounter in the middle class and the suburbs.
With thousands of men, most of whom were blue-collar and in their 20s, flocking into the small town, it transformed overnight. Drinking, crime, and prostitution flourished. It was a 180 from the modern, swanky borough of Brooklyn. All that surrounded him were sprawled-out oil fields and the same men, day after day, for months on end.
There's something about doing really hard work that for a kind of purpose that it doesn't matter so much if you agree with the people that you're doing it with. You know, the bonds out there, I disagree politically about all kinds of things, and all of that really falls away, I think, when people are working together. And when you're in kind of a dangerous situation, I think it's similar to the way people describe military service.
In many ways, the nature of the job creates a certain sense of camaraderie. You have to be able to trust and get along with your peers, because often your life depends on it. In the end, it doesn't matter where you came from, what political views you hold, or any other differences. What ties you together are the similarities.
The differences are obvious, you know, but you also don't have to scratch too hard to find the similarities. You know, people are trying to make a good living, and they're doing the best they can. And maybe you agree or disagree with their views on fracking, but the amount to which we as citizens kind of affect those decisions is sort of a whole other conversation, while we affect kind of the way that we treat each other every day.
For generations, these workers have supplied energy to the grids of the U.S., but in many ways have been forgotten by the masses or simply used as political pawns for Washington infighting. Smith says that it's critical to take a step back from the negativity.
I think one thing that I am able to offer, because I was coming from Brooklyn, is that I've got my feet in both urban and rural, both progressive and conservative America, and I have real connections with people on all these political divides. And I feel like, you know, my hope is that everybody can see themselves a little bit in this story and kind of agree to disagree where we disagree, and then hopefully find kindness more than anything else.
Today, Williston, North Dakota is no longer the oil boom town that it was back in 2013. Smith says that soon after he left in the spring of 2014, the town went bust as oil prices plummeted and men migrated out in search of new work. This is the harsh reality of the traditional energy industry. It can be a short-lived boom, forcing people to uproot their lives as opportunities wax and wane. It's a tough sector to work in, but it's an essential service that hundreds of millions rely on every day. To find out more about this topic and our guest, Michael Patrick Smith, visit viewpointsradio.org. Also, check out his book, The Good Hand, a memoir of work, brotherhood, and transformation in an American boomtown, available online and in bookstores now. For more behind the scenes, search Viewpoints Radio on Twitter and Facebook. This segment was written and produced by Amira Zaveri. Studio production by Jason Dickey. I'm Marty Peterson.
Viewpoints returns in just a moment.
Two nationwide surveys find that discrimination is a significant barrier to care for people with Alzheimer's and dementia. Half or more of non-white Alzheimer's caregivers report they face discrimination in navigating health care for their recipient. Dr. Carl V. Hill is Chief Diversity, Equity, and Inclusion Officer of the Alzheimer's Association.
The data suggests we have a long way to go to address lack of health equity in healthcare. More than 80% of non-white racial and ethnic groups say it's important for Alzheimer's care providers to understand their backgrounds and experiences. But fewer than half of Blacks and only about 60% of Hispanics and Asian Americans feel confident about their access to culturally competent providers.
The surveys also reveal a lack of trust among Blacks in research clinical trials, and half doubt that advances in Alzheimer's treatments would be shared. These findings are part of the 2021 Alzheimer's Association Facts and Figures Report. Find out more at alz.org/facts.
Did you know 1 in 4 small businesses will close due to cash flow difficulties or lack of access to capital? But they don't have to. According to Lauren Schifrin of Revolution Capital, the country's leading provider of factoring and cash flow financing, there's a safe and easy way to access your capital immediately without hurting your bottom line.
It's called factoring. We buy your invoices and pay you same day. That provides you with the immediate liquidity and access to the capital you need to grow your business. Because now more than ever, companies should have a finance partner that's on their side.
Revolution Capital provides flexible funding options to small to medium-sized businesses that would like immediate access to capital, and they respect your business relationships to help you succeed and grow. Find out more at revinc.com. That's REVINC.com.
And that's Viewpoints for this week. Viewpoints is a production of MediaTrax Communications. Follow us on Twitter, Facebook, and Instagram to learn more about upcoming shows. And find a library of past programs on Apple Podcasts, Google Play, and Spotify. Plus, you'll always find previous segments and more information about our guests at viewpointsradio.org. Join us again next week for another edition of Viewpoints. Coming up next week.
One of the things that can be really destructive isn't so much what you say. If you say it with contempt or disgust or disdain, that real dismissing way, that's one of the things that can be pretty dangerous.
How do you handle conflict? Then,
sometimes when things like this happen, we're like, oh, I'm a loser or oh, I'm a failure. But I think the idea is that, no, you're a human being and, you make decisions the best you can and you're constantly learning.
The value of grit in life. I'm Marty Peterson.
And I'm Gary Price. These stories in depth on your public affairs magazine, Viewpoints.